in the midst of Daf Tzadi Aleph, and we saw three shitas in regards to the obligations, the mitzvah of women to participate in a Korban Pesach. We had the first opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that the first Pesach, a woman or a group of women can make a Korban Pesach on their own. They don't need to be any men in the group. Whereas for the second Pesach, the makeup date on the 14th of Iyar, they would have to have a man in the group. That's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. And Rabbi Yossi says both the first and second women can make groups on their own. And as Rabbi Yossi holds, that even a single woman who says that she can eat the entire thing, the entire carbon, can make bring a carbon on her own, alone, a single person. And Rabbi Shimon says that even in the first first Pesach, she would have to join in a group with others, and in the second Pesach, that she would not bring a Korban Pesach at all. And as we saw, this is based on that in the first Korban Pesach, by the 14th of Nisan, the Torah says b'michsas nafashos, at the count of souls, meaning people, any person, or from the in the reverse, Rabbi Shimon, and it says from the fact that it says ish, each man, meaning only a male would bring a Korban Pesach, but the fact that it says michsas nafashos is enough to include women, but in the obligation, but not by themselves. And that's where we were up to in the explanation of Rabbi Shimon's opinion. Rabbi Shimon, my time. So this is about 15 lines in, 10, 15 lines in the middle of the line. Rabbi Shimon, ksiv barishan ish in ish alai. Rabbi Shimon says that because it says ish, and soon the Gemara is going to tell us which verse of ish is referring to. Ish in ish alai, and that would exclude a woman. So then if she's not obligated in a Korban Pesach, so then even tefillah namilai, meaning that she should not even be obligated in bringing Korban Pesach in the company of a group where there's men. So that's what the word ben michsas nefashos comes to tell us, that nefashos, that souls, to tell you women are included, l'tefillah, included in the obligation, but not alone in a group where there's also men. And then if you tell me so, also in Pesach they should be obligated on account of this. There's an exclusion in the second Pesach where it says that that man will carry the sin, which tells us for missing the Korban Pesach, which tells us that this is a obligation for men. The second Pesach. Now it can't be that it to mean that the same as the first, because then we'll just leave it. Ish in ish aloi, a man and not a woman. So what's he minimizing in the second Pesach? If from the obligation hashta b'rishon alone, so hashta b'rishon loy b'sheni mibayah. If in the first Pesach there's no obligation to bring it by herself, so then for sure in the second Pesach, and also not elalav mitfela, that she doesn't even have to join a group of other men. Umay ish tika amar. So which verse of ish is Rabbi Shimon learning this from? And they come Rabbi Shimon. In name of a yikhu lehem ish selavei selabois. Is it from the verse that says, and each man shall take a lamb for his household? That we need for another teaching of Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Yitzchak taught the Amar ish zeicha ve'en katan zeicha. From the fact that it says that one person shall take it for the household, and it means that on the acquisition, the intent is that it is an acquisition not only for the person buying, but also for the whole group. And it says ish, a man, to tell us that an adult can acquire on behalf of others. A child cannot make an acquisition on behalf of others. Whether this is in the concept of shlichus, of whether you can have a power of attorney, a proxy, that a child would act on behalf of an adult, which ain't shlichus lekatan, and this is in that rule that just as they can't act as a shliach, they also can't acquire for others, or this is a different rule specifically pertaining to acquisitions and transactions. Either way, the idea is, and this is a lengthy discussion, Rashi, Tosfos, and a big sugya, but the idea is that we learn from the fact that in regards to Korban Pesach, the Torah says that ish is that for the household, a man will take it. I mean, there it's not as opposed to a woman, but it's as opposed to a child, to tell us that that it requires an adult to make the acquisition so that it will be effective for everyone in the household. Ella mi-ish lefi achla. Rather, where did he learn the fact that from ish that it has to be a man and not a woman is obligated in the Korban Pesach even the first time around by herself? From the fact that it says a man according to his what he can eat, and it says a man to exclude a woman. Yes, what, Michael?
So they're basing the whole drasha on that pasuk, but that pasuk refers to Pesach Mitzrayim, right? I was just wondering why nobody bothers to say, well, yeah, that pasuk is Pesach Mitzrayim. It doesn't account for, Pesach Doros. Why? I'm saying, how do I know that pasuk? So many of the psukim have to do with Pesach Mitzrayim. There are a lot of psukim there that have to do it. They don't carry on to the Pesach Doros. They're only Pesach Mitzrayim. How do I know that pasuk also ish the Yachosu Alaseh that's not only limited to Pesach Mitzrayim. Nobody mentions that. Nobody argues that. I'm wondering why. I mean, maybe you don't know.
Why would you say it's specific to Pesach Mitzrayim? You'd have to have a reason to say that it's specific for Pesach Mitzrayim. The Torah over there has 3 or 4 parshios of Pesach, and they almost all pertain to Pesach, not only in Egypt and Mitzrayim, but for the future as well. And some of them are very specific about that it is for the future. So why would you think that this is particular to Pesach Mitzrayim, only Mitzrayim? The ones that the halachas that pertain to Mitzrayim need to be pointed out that they are specific to Mitzrayim. Otherwise, it would seem for that it's for generations.
What I remember is they pointed out the fact that we don't take the Pesach on the 1st of Nisan, and hold it for 10.
Right. So there are a few halachas that are that way. Like we don't have to take it on the 10th, which was specific in Mitzrayim. We don't have to eat it with a staff in our hands and a belt, ready to go, because that was the Mitzrayim. But in general, the mitzvahs over there are, here's a generational thing, and it says, and your children want to ask you why you do this. And I mean, this is the parshas over there are specific for generations.
Okay.
Specific halachas are not, and that is what requires.
But this is a specific halacha. That's what I'm asking.
No, this was a part of the general idea of where it says you will take a Korban Pesach for the household, and you will count the people, and if there's not enough people, you will ask your neighbor to join. I mean, that's all a part of the general Korban Pesach. In general, you'd have to find which ones are particular to Mitzrayim and not the other way around. And most of what it says over there in Parshas Bo pertains to all the generations. So the Gemara asks, which pasuk of Ish did Rabbi Shimon know this, that he says that the first Pesach also is not an obligation for a woman alone, only as a part of a group? And so he says from Ish lefi achlin. And this is the pasuk that earlier on Amid Aleph, Rabbi Yossi used to tell us that an individual is allowed to bring a Korban Pesach alone. And we said that Rabbi Yossi, who says that even a single person is allowed to bring a Korban Pesach all for themselves, is based upon a teaching of Rabbi Shimon, who says that the pasuk that Rabbi Yehuda had learned, which said, is really coming to tell you a prohibition of bringing the Korban Pesach in your gates. So Rabbi Yossi, based on Rabbi Shimon, is saying that that verse, Ba'achad Sha'arecha, is telling you that a bama, you cannot bring a Korban Pesach on your own personal mizbeach. So then, if that's true, then Rabbi Shimon also would have to agree to Rabbi Yossi that the meaning of the verse Ish L'fi Achle, the pasuk Ish L'fi Achle, each man according to what he can eat, tells us that a single person can also bring a Korban Pesach, and that would then not be available to teach us that only men are obligated and women are not obligated in Korban Pesach even the first time round, in the same way where they would bring a Korban Pesach alone. Hamid Rabbi Yossi savalak Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon Ami savalak Rabbi Yossi. And then we need that pasuk, the Shechem al Pesach al Yachid, that you can bring a Korban Pesach even for an individual. Amalacha. So Rabbi Yossi will have to. Rabbi Shimon will have to respond. Im kenich Rachmana l'fi achle. It should just say according to what he can eat. My ish. Why does it say a man according to what he can eat? That tells you that it's an obligation for men and not women. Shmas mina. So from that verse, we can learn both that it's an obligation for men and it's an obligation for that a person alone can bring the Korban Pesach and even on an individual. However, Rabbi Yossi says, no, it's an obligation for men and for women. And a woman alone, if she thinks she can eat the Korban Pesach alone, she can bring the Korban Pesach all by herself. An individual woman and women are obligated in the mitzvah. So Gemara now says, okay, so this brisa, whose opinion would this be? Kaman Azla Hadam Rabbi Elazar. This Rabbi Elazar said, Isha Berisha Chayva. There is an obligation for a woman to bring the Korban Pesach first time round, but B'Sheni Rishus, the makeup date on the 14th of Iyar, the Pesach Sheni, that would only be a choice, not an obligation. V'dechas Shabbos, and yet it would supersede Shabbos. The Gemara says, wait. Irishus, if it's not an obligation, why does it supersede Shabbos? Ela ema b'sheni rishus. Rather, what it means is this: in the makeup date, if she wants to, she can make it up. If she doesn't have to, uberishan chayva. But the first time around, it's an obligation. V'dechas Shabbos, and it does supersede Shabbos the first time around. A woman is obligated in Korban Pesach exactly like men, and can bring Korban Pesach alone. Meaning just women, and they would, and it would supersede Shabbos. Kaman Rabbi Yehuda. This is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, which we said earlier, that there's an obligation to bring the Korban Pesach the first time round. The second time round, it's not an obligation, and they can join a group with men in it, but they wouldn't make a group alone. Am Rabbi Yaakov, Am Rabbi Yochanan, Ein Oisach Habura Shekulam Gerim. Rabbi Yaakov said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan another halacha, that you don't make a group for Korban Pesach that are only converts alone. What's the reason? Shemi yidaktiku, because they may not know particular halachas and will be extra strict, and vivio l'dei psul, and then will end up invalidating the korban because they would say, you know what, we're not sure if we're supposed to do this, we're supposed to eat it, if it's kosher, it's not, and it's the Seder night. They're not going to have an ability to ask, and as a result, the Korban Pesach will be left until the morning and not eaten. And the idea is that when something is done on by tradition for many years, a lot of the halachas and scenarios that come up are not well known. However, so even if you have a group that are not Talmidei Chachamim, that are not scholars, but nevertheless, the more tradition you have, the more likely you will have seen something and remember and say, oh, this is the way we did it. And therefore, always, Rabbi Yochanan is saying is to always have some people that have more tradition in the group so that they would be able to answer the questions and less likely of the Korban Pesach being invalidated without, just out of being strict, extra strict, without knowing. Tana Rabbanan. Pesach HaMatzah Marer Berishon Chayva. So the Korban Pesach, the obligation of matzah, and the obligation of Marer are obligatory on the first day. But beyond that, the rest of the days of Yantif, they are not obligatory, but they are a mitzvah if you do so. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Shimon says, by men, it's an obligation. For women, it is a choice. If they want to, they fulfill a mitzvah. If not, not. Ahai. Which one's he talking about? Can't be talking about the Korban Pesach. Pesach kol shiva miyika. There's only Korban Pesach the first night. There's no mitzvah the rest of the days. Ela matzah mar. So must be talking about matzah or mar. Ema seifa. Rabbi Shimon ema ba'anashim chayvim menashim reshus. At the end it says that Rabbi Shimon says that would be obligatory for men and not for women. Lastly, Rabbi Shimon can it be that Rabbi Shimon doesn't agree to this halacha that we learned from Rabbi Lazar that women are obligated in eating matzah, the Dvar Torah and Torah biblically? Shenema, it says the Torah clearly juxtaposes and links the prohibition of eating chametz to the mitzvah of eating matzah, and says 7 days you shall not eat chametz, you shall eat matzah. And if there's so anybody that has a prohibition would also have the obligation. And obviously the women are prohibited from eating chametz, so women would also be obligated in the matzah in eating matzah. Rather, these three, the first day are obligatory, and thereafter it's reshus, it's a choice. Rabbi Shimon is referring to the Korban Pesach and says, and that first statement is talking about matzah, that the rest of the days, even though that's not an obligation, but there is a fulfillment. If you do it, you fulfill the mitzvah of eating matzah. The Korban Pesach itself, even that, Rabbi Shimon says the first day is not an obligation. Korban Pesach is not an obligation for women, as we saw before. They may join a group but cannot bring a Korban Pesach along. Mishnah. The next Mishnah deals with people who have a tumah that will be available that night to eat the Korban Pesach. Somebody who has who has an immediate relative that died that day, and therefore because of aninus, because of the immense sense of mourning and the immediate the day of the passing, there's a Torah prohibition of eating kachim. That Torah prohibition of eating kachim invalidates them to the degree that now when they are available again to eat the Korban Pesach that night, they have to go to the mikveh, but they can eat the Korban Pesach that night, so someone can bring the Korban Pesach for them. But that evening they may not eat other kachim, such as the chagiga or other karbanos that would have been brought. And the reason for that is that really, even though that the Torah obligation of aninus, of immense mourning before the burial of an immediate relative after their passing, that concept of aninus from the Torah is that very day. Then once the night sets, it's rabbinic. The Chachamim said in regards to the Korban Pesach, which is a kares, it's a Torah obligation that if one misses has a severe punishment of kares, of soul being cut off from its source. That's important enough that the rabbinic aninus of immense mourning, even the night after, before the passing, before the burial, that would apply for kachim, but for Pesach they removed that. So that's why this person, the onen, can eat the Korban Pesach, but cannot eat other kachim. Hashamei al Mesei. Somebody heard that they had a relative, that immediate relative that passed, but it wasn't that day. They just heard about it, but it happened before that. So that there's a aninus for the Yom Hashmuah, the day that they hear this bad news. Or if they have to remove a grave, and they're moving the bones of the immediate relative, of his father and his mother, also that day is a day of mourning for the child of the person whose bones are being moved. So Tovil, that evening they would go to the mikveh. They may eat, that night they're allowed to eat kachim, not only the Korban Pesach, but even other karbanos. Gershon is Gayer Erev Pesach. Now, someone who converted on Erev Pesach. So Beis Shammai Omrim Tovil v'Ochel es Pesach Erev. The Beis Shammai say that they can eat the Korban Pesach that very night. As long as they go to the mikveh, they can eat the Korban Pesach that night, even though they may have come into some sort of tumah that morning. So they may be immediately after tumah, and nevertheless they can eat the Korban Pesach that night because the laws of Tumah don't apply to a non-Jew, and they were not Jewish yet at the time of that Tumah, so they can immediately eat the Korban Pesach that night. Beis Hillel, however, Beis Hillel say aperish min ha'arla kaperish min ha'kever. No, somebody who gets circumcised that day. So when somebody separates from arlus, and that's not specifically if they had the bris that day, but the fact that they converted that day, now need the same tahara process as somebody who was at a grave, meaning that they need to get a full 7-day tahara. And the Gemara is going to explain that this is a rabbinic enactment that Beis Hillel have, so that because this person may have come into contact with Tumah that very day, and they would think that, oh, the laws of Tumah, all of them are uniform. You just go to the mikveh and you're fine, because that's what he did that morning. He went to a graveside. He was at a funeral, and then went to the mikveh for his conversion, and he's tahor. So he may not know this halacha, as we'll see soon. So my time. So what's the basis for the first halacha, which says an oinain can eat the Korban Pesach that night, but not other kachim? Kasava aninas alayla darbana. The reason is because even though that the day that the immediate relative passed, that person is an oinain and may not eat kachim, that night, that's a rabbinic extension of the Torah obligation of aninas. But Gabe Pesach, like me, the Chachamim released that that rabbinic extension of aninas in place of the obligation of Korban Pesach, which is a severe punishment, meaning it's a very strong obligation. Gabi Kachim, but Kachim, which is a simple positive commandment to eat the korbanos, for that the Chachamim said, no, we're going to leave the aninas, the rabbinic extension of the aninas in place, and not allow the eating of a regular Kachim. Hashamei al Meseh, but the collection of bones, or somebody hears a shemur, a chayka, a distant message or unfortunate occurrence about their immediate relative passing. So they have avelos that day, mourning that day. In the evening, they can eat the Korban Pesach. Wait, but if he was gathering and moving his immediate relative's grave, so then he's tameh. No, what the Mishnah means, he is in mourning because someone else is moving his parents' grave. Gershon is Gaia. So this last halacha, we had a machlekas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. And Beis Shammai say that the ger can eat the Korban Pesach that night. Beis Hillel say they cannot. Amar Rabba Bar Chanan Rabbi Yochanan machlekas ba'orel nachri. Let's talk about a non-Jew who converted. The Beis Hillel savri gzeira shami yitma l'shanabah. That the concern is next year, Erev Pesach, he will go to the convert who the previous year of Pesach went to a funeral. Say he was at a gravesite, and that day went to the mikveh and was able to bring a Korban Pesach. The next year he'll do the same. Go to a gravesite and become Tamei Mace, which requires a 7-day tahara. But the previous year, he knows by experience that he was able to go to the mikveh and bring a Korban Pesach. He's going to do the same the next year, not realizing that the previous year, last year I went to the mikveh and it was sufficient. So this year I'm going to do the same. And he may not realize the ishtake. Last year the reason was because he was a non-Jew, and Tumah doesn't apply to a non-Jew. It's a specifically Jewish idea. And Achshav Yisrael, but now that he's a Jew, Umekabel Tumah, and he is susceptible to Tumah, and therefore he needs a 7-day process. But by experience, he knows not that way, and so therefore every ger needs a 7-day tahara process, so that he knows that some tahara processes require 7 days. B'Shammai say there's no such enactment. Aval Orel Yisrael, but if it was a Jew who didn't have a bris and then had a bris in the day before Pesach, everybody agrees that he just goes to the mikveh that day after having been circumcised, and he can eat the Korban Pesach of that night. Why does he have to go to the mikveh at all? That's a discussion here in the Mefarshim. But we saw earlier that the Onain, who was not allowed to eat a Korban Pesach, was not allowed to eat kachim on account of the immense mourning of the day that a relative passed, since he's not allowed to eat the carbon, he has to go to the mikveh afterwards before he's allowed to eat the carbon. So to an Arel who's not allowed to eat the carbon, once he gets circumcised, he's going to be allowed to eat the carbon, so he's going to need to go to the mikveh beforehand. And they're distinct. We don't make a comparison and say just like a non-Jew who converted and had a bris needs a 7-day tahara, so to Yisrael. No, we don't say that. Tanya Namach, indeed, we have a brisa that concurs that this is a rabbinic enactment. That just for getting a bris, one would be able to go to the mikveh and eat the korban pesach that evening. So what's a mechlikas b'sham v'eshilel al orel nachri about someone who was uncircumcised and converted? B'shamay say he can immediately that night, once he goes to mikveh, eat the korban pesach that night. Le'erev and Mesil saying no, since he converted, he's going to have to wait 7 days. To which we now have essentially a rabbinic enactment that will not allow this ger, this convert, to eat the korban pesach that night. The Gemara is going to give 6 scenarios, 3 of which there are rabbinic prohibitions or rabbinic enactments in place that would that should invalidate someone from eating korban pesach, and nevertheless the rabbanon is removed to allow them to eat the korban pesach. And in 3 places that there is a rabbinic enactment that remains in place and does not allow someone to eat the korban pesach. Amar Rava. So Rava said, Arel, Hazah, v'izemel. This is the 3 rules. Someone who is uncircumcised, the spritzing of the red heifer water, the mechatas, and izemel, and a moil's knife. These are 3 cases where even though the prohibition that's hindering the access to the korban pesach is midrabanan, is rabbinic, the rabbanan kept it in place and said, yes, that rule is in place, and you cannot bring the korban pesach, even if it's going to hinder bringing the korban pesach. Hamida the Rema Makim Kares, and the Chachamim kept that prohibition in place. Einain u'metzora u'beis hapras. However, einain, somebody who had an immediate relative pass, or metzora, somebody who has a leprosy, or beis hapras, where there's a unknown grave that had been in a plowed field, and so there could be shards of bone around the kohen, which could cause tumah. Nevertheless, the Chacham said that those rabbinic prohibitions will be removed so that a person can bring a korban pesach. Because it's a korban pesach is is such an important mitzvah that the Torah gave it kares for somebody who transgresses. Therefore, the Chacham did not keep their obligations in that place. So what are these cases? The Gemara is going to explain. Arel, Hadamra. Arel, what we're talking about in this case of a ger, where even though that on a Torah level is converted, went to the mikveh, he should be available to eat the korban pesach that night. Nevertheless, there's a 7-day tahara process that Beis Hillel say remains in place, that every ger would need a 7-day tahara, and even on Erev Pesach, even if it means that they're not going to be able to bring in korban pesach, that's going to be kept in place.
That's specific for a ger, but if the person, if he had an Eved Kanani, and he was circumcised him that day, he doesn't have to wait, right? So what is it?
Because he's a Jew. He was already Jewish.
Okay, so this applies to
a non-Jew that's converting to a Jew, to become a Jew. So Arel Hada Amra, that even though that on a Torah level they can eat the korban pesach that night, the enactment of Tumah is going to remain in place and make them not available to eat the korban pesach this year, this month, and they'll have to wait till next month to eat it. Hazah, what's the case of Hazah? Spritzing the red heifer water. We know that somebody that came into contact with the dead, they're going to have a 7-day tahara process. The 3rd and 7th day, they get spritzed with the mechatas, with the red heifer water. And even though that minatora, you can spritz the blood, this red heifer water on Shabbos as well. It's not something that you're not allowed to do on Shabbos. Even though that's something that you're allowed to do on Shabbos, but it looks like you're completing and fixing someone or something. And so the Chachamim prohibited spritzing the red heifer water, the mechatas, on Shabbos. And even if that's the only way this person is going to be able to eat the Korban Pesach, if this is done in time, and if you postpone it, they're not going to be able to eat the Korban Pesach. Nevertheless, Chachamim said, sorry, the mechatas cannot be done on Shabbos, even if it's going to hinder this person from eating the Korban Pesach. The Amar Mar, as the teacher taught, Hazah Shvus, the spritzing of the red heifer water is a rabbinic prohibition on Shabbos. And yet it doesn't supersede Shabbos, even when that means that the person won't be able to eat a Korban Pesach, such as the seventh day turns out on Shabbos, and or the third day turns out on Shabbos, and in order to be able to, and that's they're in a tight squeeze. If they don't get the spritz that day, they will be off and they won't be able to bring the Korban Pesach. Still, they can't do it. Izemel, what's the case of a moil's knife? The Tani will learn kashem shemavino said derchushus arabim. Just as you can't, a moil who left his knife at home, and the only way to get it through is to carry it to do the bris. And this is somebody who wants to bring the Korban Pesach, and it's the father of a child whose bris is on that day, the eighth day, and so it would supersede Shabbos normally, but the moil doesn't have a knife there to use to do the bris. And if somebody has an uncircumcised person in their household, even a newborn child who's already obligated the eighth day, then they can't bring the Korban Pesach. And this person, the father, says, Moel, come and do the bris so that I can bring my Korban Pesach. And the Moel says, I'm sorry, it's Shabbos and I don't have a knife. Now, not only if he can't bring the knife because of a Torah level Rishus HaRabim, if you remember from Eruvin, we learned that roofs and courtyards are rabbinically prohibited, even though they are essentially a private domain, and so you should be allowed to carry there. But since they act as a public domain because they're accessible to the multiple people in the courtyard or to the multiple households for the roof, so these act like a public domain, and you're not allowed to carry there rabbinically. So even though that on a Torah level, you have a remedy, bring the knife to the moil can bring the knife and do the bris, and then the father of this baby would be able to bring the Korban Pesach. Nevertheless, we say, sorry, you can't do the bris because the knife is, you're going to have to carry in a public domain, and even though it's a rabbinic status of public domain, Midaraisa, it's not public domain, you can't do it. So these are the three places where the rabbinic enactment remains in place, even if it means that the person will not be able to bring a Korban Pesach. However, here are three that the rabbinic enactment was removed so that the person can bring the Korban Pesach. Oinen, Hada Amra, the Oinen like in our Mishnah, which it said that somebody who had an immediate relative that passed that day, the evening after that, Chachamim had extended the rules of Aninas and he may not eat a korban. However, they removed it for Korban Pesach. Mitzayra Mahi, and what's the case of Mitzayra? A Mitzayra is somebody who has a leprosy. We saw earlier, he has to be removed from all three camps. In order to have his Tahara process, he can come back into the Machane Levia, into the second camp, and not into the Beis HaMikdash. And Sha'ar Nikanor, which is one of the doorways of the Beis HaMikdash, the depth of the doorway was not sanctified, so that the Metzora can stand in there and stick his hand in, and then the Kohen will bring the korban and put it on his thumb, which is a part of the process, and he will become Tahor. Now, this Metzora also had a semen emission, which means that he's now excluded from Machane Levia as well, from the middle, from the second camp. So he really can't go in to complete his Tahara process. But this prohibition of not going in is a rabbinic prohibition in the Machane Levia. And since there's a rabbinic prohibition for him to go into the Levium camp, which is the second camp, he wouldn't be able to complete his process. So since the Torah prohibition of going into the camps was removed for the Metzora, where he's now, even though he's supposed to be out of three camps, he's allowed to go in all the way up to the line of the first camp, which is the Beis HaMikdash itself, and stick his thumb in order to get the Tahara process. So the Rabbanan also removed their prohibition of the second camp on account of his semen emission and allow him to complete it in order so that he can have the bring the Korban Pesach. So Gemara says
the Metzora had to go to the mikveh first before he went to Shar Nikona. He had to go to the mikveh.
Yeah, but if he had afterwards
afterwards he had to see. Okay, yeah. But if he had to see before he went to the mikveh,
then he would have the mikveh would help.
Oh,
well, there would be a Erev Shemesh, but the mikveh would help. Yeah. So the Tani we learned, the 8th day of the Metzora, which is when he brings the korban, the 8th day of his Tahara process, 7 days of Tahara, gone to the mikveh. The 8th day he brings his korban, and he now that night he'll be able to eat the korban Pesach. V'ra keri, and he saw he had a semen emission on that very day. So he can go to the mikveh and eat the korban Pesach. And Amr Chachamim Afav B'Shatov Ishtvul Yom Ein Nichnas, even though that he went to the mikveh. So it's Tvul Yom, since he went to the mikveh and he has to wait till the evening to come before he's allowed back in. Zen Nichnas. We let this person go in. Why? Mutav Yovi Asei Sheyesh B'Karis. We say that the Torah obligation of bringing in Korban Pesach, which is so severe that it has a kares attached to it, the punishment for somebody who misses it, is the soul is cut off. So so that should supersede the prohibition, the positive obligation of remaining outside of the camp that has a kares. Now, even though, as that we're about to see, is not a doraisa, it's a dorabanan. On a Torah, from a Torah level, there isn't even a Torah prohibition for a tful yom for somebody that had a carry to go into the middle camp, the Levium camp. As it says, that Yehoshaphat and the community of Yehuda and Yerushalayim, they stood before the house of Hashem, meaning not in the Beis HaMikdash, but in the courtyard outside on the Temple Mount, and on the Harabayis, which is the middle camp, and it was called the new courtyard. What's the new courtyard? So this renewal of the courtyard was that they came with a new prohibition that when they renewed the courtyard, they said any Balkari and a Tful Yom of a Balkari may not come into this camp. So that's a rabbinic enactment. And that rabbinic enactment was removed in the case of a Metzora, so he can complete his Tahara process, so he can bring the Korban Pesach that night. And they said a new rule, which is rabbinic, makes it rabbinic, that the Tvul Yom, somebody went to mikveh that day, may not come in even to the Machane Leviyah, into the Harabayis, the Temple Mount. Beis HaPras. And what's the third case of a rabbinic enactment that was removed to allow someone to bring the Korban Pesach? Beis HaPras. The Tananas we learned. V'shavim B'Shamei Beis Hillel. The B'Shamei Beis Hillel, they both agree that in regards to when we don't know whether there's a grave that was in a field and it was plowed, that we check the field and the path for somebody who had a Korban Pesach, where there's a machlokes, they have an argument about other korbanos, whether you can check such a field, but for a Korban Pesach, both agree you can check the field, and as we'll see, they would just blow around it in order to allow for the person to walk through there without coming into contact with the shards from the plowed grave. And for somebody eating truma, there's no plowing, there's no checking. My boitkin. And how would they do this checking? Amar of Yehuda Shmuel, so they said in the name of Shmuel, Menapeach Beis HaPras v'Hoilech, would fan the ground so that any shards that are large you'd see, and any small ones would be blown away. V'Hoilech, and then he could just walk forward to bring his Korban Pesach. Rabbi Yehuda bar Abaye Mishmeder, Rabbi Yehuda Amar Beis HaPras Shanidash Tor. And if it had been walked on many times, where those shards would be underground, so there would be no concern of actually coming in contact with it, and it'd be too small for there to be an ohel for you leaning over it, and therefore that's not going to be a problem in any case. But even though that these are rabbinic prohibitions, everybody agrees that in regards to Korban Pesach, just checking and fanning it would be sufficient to allow him to bring the Korban Pesach. So we had 3 places where Chachamim kept their enactment, which eventually would mean that the person cannot bring a Korban Pesach, and 3 times they allowed. A lot of discussion as to why these 3 versus the others, and the basis, not for now. The main thing is that there are some cases where Chachamim's enactment were kept in place, even though that will hinder someone's ability to bring a Korban Pesach, and 3 places where they did not. Isha. With this, we complete the 8th parak of Pesachim, Isha, and we shall come back to you as Hashem Yisparach. Somebody who was tamei, so he couldn't bring a Korban Pesach the first time around, or it was in a path too far away from Yerushalayim that he wouldn't be able to make it in time to personally bring the Korban Pesach. And therefore didn't bring the Korban Pesach as Harisha in the 14th of Nisan. Yasa es Hasheni. It will go ahead and bring the Korban Pesach the 14th of Iyar as a make-up date for the miss. Similarly, if they forgot about it or was held up against his will by something, also would not bring the Korban Pesach. The first time round is going to be Yases Hasheni. He's allowed to bring the makeup date, the Korban Pesach, on the 14th of Iyar. So why specifically did the Torah say that he was tamei or he was in a distant way? If it's any type of distraction, any type of something that withheld him, she'elu peturas mikares, to tell you that these would be exempt of kares, of the excision, the soul being cut off. But somebody who neglected to bring the Korban Pesach, that person is going to be held liable and kares unless he brings the makeup date where he would save himself from kares, from the soul being cut off. It said, this person himself, he was at a distance and couldn't make it to the Korban Pesach. Now, but he was, doing the best he could, and as he got through traffic, he would be able to make it in time to be there for the Seder, to be there to eat the Korban Pesach, but he himself cannot, it won't be there to bring the Korban Pesach himself. So somebody else can put him on there, say, so-and-so is still stuck in traffic on the way into Yerushalayim. We're going to include him on our lamb, and he's going to be here by the evening. He'll be here, be able to eat it. So shachtu v'zarkalav, they shechted and spritzed the blood with the intent for him as well. So Rav Nachman Omar Hutza, Rav Nachman says it counts. Rav Shesha Samalai Hutza, Rav Shesha says no. The Torah explicitly said if he's at a distance, he can't bring the Korban Pesach. He wasn't here to bring it. He doesn't count. Rav Nachman Omar Hutza mechazudacham chas rachman ali. Rav Nachman says no. The Torah was only being compassionate on him to give him a makeup date because he missed it. But if somebody brought it for him, great. And if somebody brought it for him, well, how wonderful, he gets a blessing. Rav Shesha says no, it doesn't work for him. Just like somebody who's tamei, the Torah said you are excluded and can't bring it. So too, if you're at a distance, you didn't make it in time to bring the Korban Pesach, you're excluded. So Nachman says, how can I prove my opinion that if it was brought on his behalf, it counts? The Tanan we learned, it says in our mission, if he was tamei, or if it was brought on his or if he was at a distance. And he didn't end up doing the first Pesach. Yasa Sheni makes a second, which we can infer means, but if he was at a distance and did bring the Korban Pesach, it would count. Yeah, Mechalal di Ovid, di Bay Ovid. Rav Shesha says no. How would you explain the next verses? The next line in the Mishnah, the Ketana, it says, Shagagay Nanas. If he made a mistake and forgot about it, or he was held up, somebody had a gun at his back, or whatever it is. He didn't do it the first time round. Yasa Sheni, he has a makeup date, the 14th of Iyar. Would you also infer from the fact that it says if he was held up and didn't make it, meaning but if he had done it, it would be good? He couldn't do it. He was being held up, or he forgot about it. Rather, what it means is if he was negligent and forgot about it, or he was held up and he didn't do it, or if he was just simply lazy and didn't do it. Either way, he can make it up the next time. But and on that it says if he had done it, it would be okay. So too in the first part, if he's tamei or at a distance, it also means there is a certain way that he can be quasi tamei, such as at an immediate relative past, and that he wouldn't bring it. But if he did bring it, it would count as valid. Ravashi says our Mishnah seems to infer that. Tomorrow we'll see what that inference in the Mishnah itself is. Have a great day.